So this school year, we reached a momentous occasion in the life of our house. Our youngest is now in middle school, which, great. And the one thing about our youngest is that she's a joiner, and she likes to do things, which means that she oftentimes has to stay after school, after the buses bring her home, after the buses normally bring her home, so somebody has to go and get her. Up until recently, that was my job, except now the oldest has a driver's license, and now it's his job. There are advantages. But I was thinking about last fall, the first couple of times this happened. Of course, she would get out of wherever she was, and she would immediately text me, "Dad, I'm done. Where are you?" And then, about 10 seconds or 15 seconds later would go by, and then I would get, "Dad?" And then about another 10 or 15 seconds would go by, because I'm a good person and I don't text and drive. And then I'd get, "Where are you parked, Dad?" And this would go on and on and on and on. And I'd finally get there and I'd be like, "I'm across the street." And I finally had to tell her, after this happened a couple of times, "Look, I'll get there when I get there. Just have some faith, I'll come get you. If I'm 10 minutes late, then maybe bug me." But, and I was thinking about this, when I was a kid, right, we didn't have this, right? You literally just stood on a corner and hoped that some adult you knew would come pick you up and take you home. That was every day after school. We stood at the same spot, and in some amount of time, maybe a few minutes, maybe several minutes, you would hope Mom and her, giant station wagon would pull up and we would all get in, right? You just sort of had to take things on faith then, and in a way that, frankly, I don't know that our kids today have to do as much. And so I bring that up because that's what we're going to talk about today, this idea of faith. And we're going to especially talk about faith is that thing that we are called on to have when things are out of our control. And the reality is, if we're all being honest, most of us don't like it when things are out of our control, right? We don't like it when somebody else decides something or somebody else's changes something that we prefer wasn't changed. It doesn't matter how big or little that change is. Right? We got a perfect example of this. Actually, a few years ago, there were several headlines that made across on newspapers and stuff, saying something along the lines of, "Oh, by the way, Kraft changed the mac and cheese 6 months ago, and nobody noticed." Right? Do you remember this? When they came out 6 months after they had apparently made some change. They wanted to make it a little healthier, and I guess they changed some of the ingredients so that it was the colors weren't artificial, the colors were natural, though I don't think that color orange exists in nature. So there's still some chemistry happening somewhere if you've ever seen Kraft mac and cheese, right? But they went ahead and actually changed it, and they changed the ingredients on the box because, of course, we all read the ingredients on the box. And then just didn't tell anybody. They didn't tell anybody for 6 months, and nobody noticed and nobody figured it out. And I thought that was really interesting. I wonder why they would do it that way. I mean, after all, right, they were actually trying to make it better. They were trying to make it healthier. They're trying to move some artificial ingredients, put some natural ingredients back in it. Why wouldn't you celebrate that at the time? And then I thought about it. I'm like, oh, yeah, that's right. They were doing this at a time where the internet exists. And if they'd announced ahead of time, "Hey, we're going to change the mac and cheese," the internet would have exploded, right? There would have been all these pieces online. "Why is Kraft killing my childhood? I am boycotting the new Kraft mac and cheese. It's going to be terrible. It's going to be awful." You can just see the memes now, right? How dare they make it healthier? Right? I can picture, you really would just see a Kraft mac and cheese box that says Kraft Woken Cheese or something like that, right? That's what would have happened. And they were smart enough to know that. So they're like, well, we're just not going to avoid all that, and then we're going to change it without anybody noticing. It's a small thing, but I think they were probably right in their concern, and actually told people later that they figured there was more downside than up to telling people ahead of time. Because we don't like it when things are out of our control, and we don't like it when things change. We don't like it when there's something that happens that we can't affect or be a part of. And we certainly don't like it if those things especially affect us, right? I think we're all aware of this. No matter how easygoing you think you are, or we think we are, there will be something that if somebody changes, you will not be happy about it. And it may be the mac and cheese, I don't know. But I'm just remembering the time I tried to say, "Hey, maybe we shouldn't print bulletins anymore." You were not having any of that. That is the one thing. I've only ever got pushback in this church, like, hey, can we try something? Every other time you're like, yeah, we should do that, we should do that. I'm like, what if we didn't have bulletins? Nope. So you have your bulletins. Thank you, Betty, for taking care of those for us every week. I can learn. Faith is that thing that we have when there is something going on that we are not in charge of and that we can't change. That's why I wanted to use this story for Daniel today. So we're back in Daniel, and this, of course, is we're ahead a little bit. Daniel has got himself in trouble again. But first and foremost, it's interesting to look at what it is that Daniel is doing. So Daniel, again, was carried off, right? He's not home, right? God's land and God's people were basically invaded, and some number of people were carried off, including Daniel. And Daniel had some abilities and some skills that the kings of the foreign land found useful, and so they kept him around. And he interpreted dreams and did all these things, and over time his stature grew. It's interesting. One of the first things you might wonder about is like, why is he even doing this, right? Like, why is he even helping these people? They're obviously, these are the invaders after all, right? He's not helping out his people. It's not his home. What's going on? Well, as it happens, when the Jews were first carried off in the exile, the Babylonian exile, Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, actually gave instructions. And the instructions that he gave was, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent to exile from Jerusalem, build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat what they produce, take wives and have sons and daughters, take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage. He says, I know you're not where you want to be, but while you are there, do what you can. Continue to live life, continue to have families, continue to grow, and continue to be God's people. So these were the instructions that they had. So that's why Daniel is doing what he does. He's saying, I am still God's person. I am still God's child. I still belong to God. I still have these gifts from God. And I have these orders from God to continue to use them wherever it is I may be. Daniel was basically told those things that you can change, those things that you can do, those places that you can make a difference. And in those places you can't, trust God. And so that's how Daniel behaves. And he continues to behave this way, and it keeps going and going and going until it gets to the point where he starts to make the wrong people mad. And so much like in our children's message, that's pretty much how it went if you look at the story of Daniel, right? The other advisors who are of that place, right, who are not foreigners and outsiders, the other advisors to the king get really jealous of Daniel because he's doing, frankly, a really good job. And so they conspire to basically get rid of him, and they use the one thing that they can use, which is Daniel's faith. Because as much as Daniel will do whatever he needs to do to continue live and survive the way God wants him to, their advisors correctly surmise that there's still a place he won't go. And so Daniel makes a practice of praying 3 times a day. It says it in the scripture a little before the story. He goes, he flings open the window, and he faces Jerusalem, and he offers his prayers 3 times a day, and he's been doing it the whole time. And so when the decree comes down, and the advisors trick the king, and he's not allowed to do it, they're literally standing outside of his window, just waiting to see if he will. And of course, he knows what's going on. He knows this decree's gone out. He knows he can't change it. Apparently, the king can't change it either, which is sort of a dumb rule, right? I think if you make the rules, you can change the rules. But that actually, if you remember, happened in Ruth too. Like, well, I already gave the order. I can't take it back. And I'm like, well, if you can't, who can, right? But apparently you can't. So Daniel knows all of this, and he's like, well, what am I supposed to do, right? And you can just see it. He's like, what am I supposed to do? He's like, well, what can I do? I can't change what the king has done. Daniel can't change the decree that's gone out. He can't change the fact that the other advisors are jealous of him, mad at him. But what can he do? He can pray. He can pray as he's always prayed. He can rely on those things he's always relied on. He can continue to reach out to God. And so that's what he does. And because he does that, Daniel ends up in the situation that is probably the most out of control any one of us would probably ever be, which he said he finds himself in a pit that he cannot get out of, with animals that he cannot control, And he has no choice in that time and in that place to have faith in God. Now, one thing I never asked myself, because this is a Sunday school story, right? We all grew up hearing this story in Sunday school. If you went to Sunday school as a kid, Daniel and Lion's Den, they made a really good VeggieTales out of it, because of course they did. And the one thing I never really questioned until I was doing the preparation for this is like, why is there a pit of lions, right? Isn't that sort of a weird thing to keep around? Like, I know kings are eccentric and they do odd things, right? But why exactly would you keep a pit of lions around? And it turns out at that time, they would do things not dissimilar to like what the Romans would do, where they would capture and keep a bunch of animals and they would put on a show with them. And they would basically make a to-do in like an arena or something for, hunting them and all that sort of stuff. So these were basically kept, these were basically animals, probably amongst several other animals that were kept for show. They really weren't kept for this purpose. They just happened to work for this too. So that is not apropos of nothing. I just thought it was interesting. So Daniel is in that place where he has to have faith because everything is literally out of his hands. He is in that place where he has no choice but to rely on God. And of course, we know where the story goes. And much like his friends all those years before that were tossed into the furnace, somehow, some way, God comes through. The amount of faith that it must take in that moment, the amount of faith that it must take to trust in that moment, is something that I don't know that I personally probably have ever felt. Daniel has something special going on. In our little character breakdown, I think Daniel can probably rate his faithfulness at a 10. If anybody can, it's him. Most of us will never encounter that sort of moment, right? Most of us will never encounter a moment where we literally, where our lives are threatened in some way, in that way. And we will usually, the stakes will probably never for us be as high as it was for Daniel. However, each and every one of us has encountered a time or a place or a moment where we realize there's something going on in the world that is completely out of our hands. There is something we want to be a certain way, but we can't make it be that certain way. There's something that needs to be done, but we recognize we are not the ones that can do it. And we have to rely on somebody or something else. Those are the moments when our faithfulness will come out and our faithfulness is tested. Sometimes we'll do okay, and sometimes we won't. Sometimes we will give in to the temptation to think that we can actually control something that we actually cannot control. So there's a great example of this that we draw from John Wesley's life. So I got to tell you, I spent a couple weeks ago, I got a text message from the grandchild of one of the people in our church. And she was in a world religions class and needed to talk to somebody about Methodism and Methodist history and all of that. And for some reason, this person in our church thought that I would be the one to talk to because, as apparently she was told, he loves geeking out about history. And he loves geeking about it with the church. I'm sure you will have fun together. I don't know why they thought that. But I did get some notes. I got a text from her later after we were done. She's like, thanks for the conversation. It was great. By the way, the transcript from it was 11 pages. Like, yeah, okay. Did you need more? So with that, I'm taking that as permission. We're going to dive a little into church history again, because that's what I like to do. And so John Wesley, as we know, or if you don't, that's fine. John Wesley is the founder of the Methodist Movement, the one that got this whole thing going. John Wesley had an interesting life growing up, but he eventually, through his years as he grows up, he eventually lands at Oxford. Right? And that's really where Methodism begins, is it basically starts as a college group, right? It's basically, it's a group of guys in college, and yeah, it was all guys at the beginning, but it was a group of guys in college meeting together, and quite literally what they did is they got together to pray together and read the Bible. They started to do that, and then over time, they started to grow and develop, and they started to do more, and they started to ask themselves some questions like, hey, when God tells us, or when Jesus tells us, to love the poor and visit the prisoner and all that, like, what if he really meant it? And what if we actually started doing that? Now, at the time, this was not something that people did, especially good and respectable people. This was not the kind of thing that you did, but they decided to do it anyway. And so over time, they did this. They found a few people to go with them to do it. And one of those people that eventually came with them to do it was the guy named William Morgan. So William Morgan was another young man at Oxford together, and would do things like go and take food to the prisoners, because they didn't actually feed people then. You had to have people bring you in food. Prisons were very different. And they would do that, and they'd visit the orphan, and they would take whatever resources they happened to have around and use them to bless those who they found around them needed blessing, right? Most of us today, if we found out that our kid went off to college and joined a club where they got together to read scripture and pray and do nice things for other people, we would probably be pretty happy about that, right? I know I would, because that was not my college experience. That is not what I spent time doing in college by any means. And I would love it if that's what happened. In Wesley's time, not so much. And in fact, they get a letter eventually at one point. So I have a collection of all Wesley's letters. Wesley actually gets a letter from the father named Richard of William Morgan. And actually, the first letter is actually to his son. And he says, "You shall no longer be tied to any fixed allowance." He's basically cutting his money. "What sums are necessary for your health shall immediately be remitted. But then I must tell you, it is for those uses only, your health and education, that I mean to supply you. You must leave me to judge for myself what portion of my substance is fit for me to dispose of for charitable uses," emphasis mine, "of which I will be distributing myself. What I put into your hand should be disposed of according to my directions. I am told by a most worthy clergyman," I love that he talked to his clergyman, "I am told by a most worthy clergyman that it is sinful to do otherwise." I am told by a worthy clergyman that it is sinful to do otherwise. "I could not but advise with a wise, pious, and learned clergyman. He told me that he has known the worst of consequences follow from such blind zeal, and plainly satisfied me that it was a thorough mistake of true piety and religion." Oh, I love the 17th century. Basically saying, I went and talked to my pastor, and he said, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't help people. That's not the way this works. So this is the letter that William gets from his dad. Now, what also happens is, that William is actually not in good health. And so this is the this is 1732, and William is not in good health, and eventually that summer actually has to leave school because he is not doing well, and he actually goes home to be with his dad. And they decide that, the air where he was up in the north of England wasn't good for him because, again, this is the 1700s and we don't really have what we call medicine. So they're very interested in the air. They're like, where you need to be is you need to be by the seaside. Like, that's where the air is apparently good. And so they put him on a horse and were sending him down to be by the seaside where they thought he would do better. Unfortunately, he doesn't make it, and he passes away. Later, the father would write a letter to John and Charles. And in that letter to John and Charles, he would basically apologize. And he would say, I didn't quite know what I was doing before. My son told me about you and the things that you were doing. Of course, what you were doing was good. I'm sorry to have to tell you he's gone. Thank you for all you have done. That's basically what he said. John has to write them a letter. John actually writes them about 6 months later and read a reply, because at this point, Methodists had gotten noticed. And William's father was not the only one objecting to what it is that they were doing. A lot of people were objecting to what it is that they were doing. And in fact, so many people were concerned about what they were doing, and they might get all these kids excited and zealous to go out and do good works in the world, and we just simply cannot have that. That pamphlets were printed up against the Methodists. In fact, it's 1732 when we were actually first called Methodists, and it is in one of these pamphlets that we are called Methodists, and it is not a term of endearment, right? It is a term of derision. And in the pamphlet where we were first called Methodists, John and Charles are actually accused directly of killing William. They said that what they were asking him to do and all the fasting they were doing and all of their religious practice and all the burden they were putting on themselves was just too much for this young man. And these people were squarely putting the blame on John and Charles for what happened. And so John writes this very long letter to William's father and says, I don't know if you've seen this, but if you have, let me tell you how things were. He wasn't really actually fasting that much. He goes through this whole long thing to defend himself to William's dad. And of course, his dad writes back and he says, I haven't seen it, but even if I did, I wouldn't be concerned. You need not trouble yourself with this about me. But John was troubled by it. And John is a young man at this time. He's in his early 20s, and he was troubled by it. He could see what was going on. He could see that he had this group of people. They were getting together. They were doing good work. They were growing. Things were happening. People were being blessed. But he could also see the growing amount of people and the growing amount of resistance he was receiving back. And you can see in his diaries and at that moment, he wasn't sure what to do or where to go. So and this goes on for a couple of years, and then something really surprising happens that I never quite understood for the long time as to why this happened. But in 1735, Wesley gets on a boat and decides to go to Georgia and be a missionary, kind of out of the blue. And if you but now that I've gone back and read some of his journals, you can see he's still struggling. He's struggling with what he's supposed to be doing. They want him to take a church, right? He's been offered a church up in Epworth where his dad is, so he can be a parish pastor like they all expect him to be. He doesn't want to do that. He gets in a fight with his family about it. He decides, I can do more good at Oxford, so I'm going to stay here, and then I'm going to teach. And then within 3 months, he's not at Oxford anymore. He's on a boat heading to the Georgia colony. Now, this was a thing that happened a lot then. So you got to remember, we're at the height of the British Empire, right? They are everywhere. They've got boats going everywhere. They've got trade going everywhere. And one of the things that especially young people of faith, young clergy especially, get excited about is the British Empire is now getting into places where people have never heard of Jesus, right? They've got colonies in America. They've got colonies in India. They've got colonies in Australia. And there's all these people there who have never heard of Christ. And Wesley gets really excited about that idea, as a lot of people do, like how wonderful it would be and how amazing it would be to be the first one to do that. And he's looking around, especially in England and Western Europe, and saying, everybody here already knows. Maybe I should go there and do some work there. That sounds more interesting, and that sounds more exciting. And in the last letter he writes to a friend before he gets on the boat, he actually confides in the friend and says, nobody's ever actually asked me why I'm doing this, and I haven't really volunteered it. And he goes on to kind of confess to his friend, I'm not actually going to do, it's not really for other people, I'm going for me. And he talks about how he wasn't sure in his faith. He wasn't sure what he believed. He wasn't sure if he really trusted God. He wasn't sure if he really trusted Christ. And he hoped by going and doing this work, he may say God may do some good things through him, and his faith might grow. Now, what John doesn't know, that we know on this side of history, is that for John, Georgia will be a disaster, an absolute and complete disaster. He actually gets infatuated with a young lady, isn't sure if he should get married, because if he gets married, then he can't be a missionary anymore, and he gets very, very conflicted. And this whole thing goes down, and the young lady happens to be the daughter of somebody important, so they make him mad and everybody mad, to the point that not 18 months after he arrives, he is literally spirited away on a boat in the middle of the night, so he will not be arrested. And then he gets back to New England, where his brother Charles was, and they get on a boat and they come back. So by 1737, John is back at Oxford. He's back in that upper room, back around some of those same people, now with no idea what to do. He tried to take charge. He tried to do what he wanted to do, and for some reason, it didn't work out. It's easy for us to see on this side, and it's easy for me as I'm reading this to kind of bang my head against the wall. It's like, John, how did you not see what was already in front of you? How did you not see the good work that God was already doing there? How did you not see what the Holy Club was and what these Methodists were and the potential in them? How did you not see that as an opportunity for you to grow and develop? How did you not do that? Why did you run away to somewhere where you thought things would be easier? Because literally that's what he thought. He thought, I will go where nobody's heard of Jesus, and nobody will be there to contradict me, and nobody will be there to criticize me, and I will be able to do things the way that I want to do them. It did not work out for him, and honestly, a lot of the time, it does not work out for us when we try to do it the same. So Wesley returns, and then later on, a few months later, has what he calls his Aldergate experience. And if you've ever heard the term that talk about John Wesley had his heart strangely warmed, right? And he talks about that as a moment in which he really felt his faith deepen, that he really did trust. Because at the end of the day, that is what faith is about. Faith is about trust. Yes, it's about faith and trust in ourselves, trust that we are one of God's beloved children, given good gifts to share. But more importantly, it's about faith in God. It's about having faith that God has put more in this world than just us. That yes, God has given us work to do, but God has given other people work to do as well. And that it is not our job to do everybody else's work. It's having faith that God will provide for that while we work to figure out what is our work to do. That really is, at the end of the day, what living faithfully is about. Living as a faithful person doesn't mean that life's going to be easy. In fact, if you continue Wesley's journey forward, it's actually going to get a lot harder. They'll eventually start throwing bricks at him. Really. They'll run him out of town. He used to joke, he used to say all the time, I will not preach in a church that doesn't have a back door because I don't want to walk through the congregation. I want to be able to walk out the back after I've done making everybody mad. He did get invited to preach multiple times in places, if you wouldn't imagine that. It would actually get really hard from John. The Methodist movement would also, though, continue to grow, continue to challenge, continue to call people to live better lives, call people to live lives of service, call people to really take seriously the things that God has asked us to do. He would help Methodists become those people who really do all they can to embody the rule that we are to love God, love our neighbor, and love ourselves. Even our neighbors that we don't like very much and annoy us. Even our neighbors who don't look like us. Even those who are far away. Being a faithful person is about recognizing first and foremost is that we're not in charge. We are not in charge of the world. We are not in charge of what other people do. We are not in charge if the sun comes up tomorrow or goes down tonight. But being a faithful person also means that we trust that where there is things that need to be done, where there is work to be done, that God will provide for it. And sometimes the thing that God has provided to get that work done is us. Being a faithful person is about looking around and saying, okay, what can't I do? What can't I control? Have a middle school girl in your house, you will find out immediately. And what can I? What can I do? What is in my control? How can I behave? How can I bless? How can I be God's hands and feet in all the places and times that I can? That is faithfulness. Because faithfulness says all that stuff that's outside of my control, it's not that it's unimportant, it's not that I don't care about it, it's not that I'm even going to worry about it. We all worry about our kids and our grandkids and all that, even though we can't control them. But at the same time, I'm going to spend my time and my energy and effort on those things that I can. Those places I can do my little bit to build out God's kingdom. And I'm going to trust and have faith that God is providing for all those other places too. So when you think about your faithfulness and where you are in that faithfulness realm, and where you want to grade yourself in your faithfulness on our 1 to 10 scale, and again, nobody's a 1. Somebody put a 1 in there, and I was mad. So this is what we're talking about. We're talking about that our ability, that thing that God asks us to do, to continue to have trust in Him, continue to have trust in one another, even in those places where we do not have control over what happens. Because it is those places that our faithfulness will come out. So you're invited in all the ways that we have available to you to take your little one-question poll and sit and consider and think, where are you? Is faithfulness a gift of yours? And I can tell you, having been here for almost 5 years, having gotten to know very many of you very well, I believe this is one of those places that we excel. I believe this is one of those places that we do well. The ability to recognize what we can do and what we can't, and to spend most of our time and energy worrying about the things that we can, and trusting God with the things that we can't. Now, I'm a little biased, because I get to stand up here and do all this stuff. But I'm going to tell you, I think this is one of those places where we, as a group, have practiced this well. And I will tell you in future weeks, we will get to places where I think we might need to do some work. Amen.